Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight I'm going to sum up the situation of Oklahoma Indian languages and what can be done to improve that situation. Some of what I say, most of it will repeat what we've mentioned in other shows, but some things I think are worth repeating. First of all, let's look at the number of Indian languages still spoken in Oklahoma. We have a graphic on this. It's a two-part graphic because there is, thankfully, a pretty long list. The languages are Arapaho, about 100 speakers left. These estimates are very rough. If you know otherwise, please let me know. I always try to improve the figures as situations develop. Caddo, about 25 speakers. Cherokee, maybe 9,000, which is the highest number. Cheyenne, about 400. Chickasaw, maybe 600. Chiricahua Apache, spoken by the Fort Sill Apache tribe, one speaker that I know of. Choctaw, about 4,000 speakers. Comanche, maybe 100. Delaware, that needs updating, sorry, one speaker left of Delaware that I know of. Yuchi, about 5 speakers. Iowa, maybe 30. Kickapoo, perhaps 400. Kiowa, perhaps 400. Meskwaki, which is the language still spoken in the Sac and Fox tribe, maybe 30 speakers. Muskogee, spoken by the Creek and Seminole tribes and some tribal towns, about 5,000. Osage, 5 to 10. Oto, about 4. Pawnee, 7. Plains Apache, maybe 3 speakers left. Ponca, 35 speakers. Potawatomi, maybe 20. I don't think all of those are in Oklahoma, though. Seneca, maybe 10. Shawnee, this is the wildest estimate I have. I just don't have good information, and I need some education on the Shawnee tribes and the language still spoken. So I say somewhere between 200 and 800. I suspect that's really at the low end or even less than the low end of that. But I just don't know for sure. Wichita, last I heard, 2 speakers left. So that gives you an idea of what part of the problem is. That is, we still have about 25 languages spoken in this state, which is wonderful. There's a lot of teaching going on, but in almost all of the languages, in almost all of the tribes, the number of speakers is very low. And even in a tribe like Cherokee with thousands of speakers, there's another problem that has to do with the demographics, not the absolute number, but the demographics. That is, the percentage of people in the tribe who speak the language is very low, and even more importantly, the age demographics. In almost every tribe, it's only the elders who speak it. In most of the tribes, it's probably people in their 70s and on up who still speak the language. There are only, I'd say, 3 or so tribes where children are still being raised with the language. That's our next graphic. Let's take a look at that. Language is still spoken by children. And they are Cherokee, I know for sure. There are still children being raised with Cherokee as one of their first languages, if not their first language. Choctaw also, Kickapoo also. And Chickasaw, I've heard there are, I'm just not quite sure if that's still true or not. And Creek, recently there were children learning Creek as one of their first languages, but I'm not sure if that's still true either. So that's, that demographic situation is even more important than the absolute numbers. And another really important point of the part of the situation that you have to understand is that there are no language communities as such for the most part. I think Cherokee may be an exception to that, maybe the only real full-fledged exception to that. By language community, I mean some place in the community where you would go and you would be surrounded by the language. If you think about the language community for English, it sort of infuses everything in modern American life. You can go and buy your groceries in English, you can vote in English, you can take your driver's test in English, you can talk to your neighbors in English, you can watch TV or listen to the radio in English, etc., etc. You get your schooling in English. So everything is in English. You're always surrounded by it. It's always there. If you're not good at it yet, you can pick it up in all those different kinds of environments where the language is used in everyday life. With the Indian languages of Oklahoma, for the most part, there is no place where you can go and be surrounded by the language and know that that's where that language and only that language is spoken, or primarily that language. If you were wanting to learn maybe one of the European languages, if you were an American wanting to learn German and you didn't have German speakers around, you could go to Europe at least and you could be surrounded by German in some of the German-speaking nations. You can go to the old country to learn the old European languages if you don't have someone to teach you here. For the Indian languages, for the most part, this is the old country. So if you're down to 2 or 9 or 100 speakers, that's it. That's all there are. And if they are not in constant contact with each other, forming a language community, then there is no language community. A sort of corollary to this lack of language communities is a lack of motivation, by which I don't mean people don't want to learn their language. What I mean is, for most part, young people who want to learn their language, there's no place where they would go where they would have to use the language, where they couldn't get by with just English. So in that sense, there's no real need for anyone to learn the language. They feel a desire, or they think it's culturally important, but if they didn't get around to doing it, it wouldn't cause anything that's going on in their life to have to come to a standstill. It would be a loss. I think most people would agree it would be a loss if they don't pass on their language. But life can go on without it. So in that sense, there's no need. If you're an immigrant who comes to this country not speaking English and you want to go mail a letter, you have to learn enough English to ask for what you want. Or if you're a tourist and you want to catch a plane somewhere, you have to know enough English, unless you have a translator with you, you have to know enough English to inquire about the schedule and the fares and so forth. There is no place where you have to know a certain amount of Choctaw to get the job done, unfortunately. Now, one exception to this in some communities is in a sort of ceremonial setting where you need to speak the language in order to participate in stomp ground ceremonies or something like that. But the number of those situations is shrinking rapidly. It used to be that native languages were used in the Native American church, in the peyote tent. And as I haven't been in a peyote tent myself, but from what I've been told, in almost every tribe, if not every tribe, most of the meetings are now done in English because they don't want to exclude the young people who don't speak the old language. So that's sort of an overview of the situation. Now, the other part of what I wanted to talk about tonight is how are we going to change this? What works in terms of keeping these languages alive, or what's likely to work? And I'm speaking, everything I say will be my own opinion. It's based on what I know about languages and language teaching and linguistics and what I've observed in getting to know different programs around the state. Most of it, I think, is pretty well backed up with solid research in terms of its reasonableness. Of course, hope is always a big factor, and if people are enthusiastic and hopeful enough, they may be able to beat the odds and make something work where you wouldn't think it would be able to. But still, there are some general statements we can make. Let's recap again what I was saying about the situation. Let's look at our next graphic, and we'll kind of state this as the problem and then the solution. The problem is the situation I just outlined: low numbers of speakers and low percentage, the age demographics, the loss of language community, and therefore the loss of real need for the language in the sense that I explained. So what's the solution to all of that? Well, you have a situation where in most cases, only the elders are still fluent. The children want to learn. There is no ready, set community where they need to know it. They can't learn it in their home because their parents don't speak it. All of this adds up to what might seem at first like a very simple solution. You get those elders to teach the children in some way. You use language immersion as much as possible, which will kind of create an artificial community, a place where you have to use the language to get by. And you emphasize conversation as much as possible. Get people talking the language, not just looking it up in a book, not just memorizing a ceremony or a song, which is good, but doesn't save the language. So connect the elders with the children, do language immersion, and emphasize conversation. That'll solve your problem. Easier said than done, of course. What does this mean specifically? Well, it would mean that it would certainly suggest very strongly teaching the language in the preschool. The very youngest children will have the easiest time learning, and if you can get some of those elders to come to the preschools and be either teachers or teacher assistants and speak to the children as much as possible in the language and not in English, not give them lessons, just interact with them in the language and encourage them in every way to talk and participate, in other words, learn how to converse in the language. That's always a very good idea, and there are a number of places that are trying this now. Another approach is, especially for a little bit older children, this is potentially applicable to anyone, even adults, what I'll call adopt a grandparent plan. That is where you go and find an elder person. It might be your own grandparent if you're lucky enough to have one who's fluent, or it might be someone else's grandparent that you kind of adopt for this purpose. Go to them and ask them to teach you. There's a specific kind of mode of language teaching that's becoming very popular in a lot of Native American communities in California and now also in Oklahoma and in other places around the country, called master-apprentice language learning. And the idea of that is that you have a master who's usually an elder who is the fluent speaker and is going to teach. Master means teacher, and the apprentice in this case is the language learner. Usually it's set up as a one-on-one process, so it's very intimate, very intense. You always have each other's attention. It's a very intense, concentrated kind of method. The classic model is you spend large amounts of time together in language immersion, that is using only the language you're trying to learn, no English. Large amounts of time means maybe 20 hours a week for a period of a year or 2 or 3. I have spoken to people who say after about 2 years they feel they're now they're fluent speakers, maybe not fully fluent, but they consider themselves fluent speakers. They can get along in the language and do whatever they need to do in the language. But 2 years of 20 hours a week is a massive commitment. Adopt a grandparent, if it's not a strict master-apprentice program, could be a little more fluid. It might take a little longer, not be as efficient of a method, but it can also be very, very good. The other idea of master-apprentice, and that I would also suggest for adopt a grandparent as an approach, is that you not try to not have the master or the grandparent try to give lessons to the learner, have them just do things with the learner in the language. And so this combines language and culture, which is very good in language learning, and it teaches not just rote things, ceremonial things, memorized things, but real living language. That is, it starts to rain, what do you say? You stub your toe, what do you say? Someone hands you something, how do you thank them? Someone greets you, how do you greet them back? You learn all of this give and take and living interaction that is typical of a real live language and not just a relic. So that's a really good approach. The preschools and then the one-on-one, adopt a grandparent or master apprentice. And another good thing to do, again, I said emphasize teaching children, doing immersion and doing conversation. This would be more related to the conversation. And this point is to try to reinstitute the language at least a little bit in the tribe and at the tribal headquarters. This could mean going to the tribal administration building, the actual headquarters building, and putting up signs on things in the language, not only in English, but say a sign on the restroom or the chairman's office or the entrance to something or the library or the NAGPRA office or whatever. Come up with a name in the language for these and put the English and the native language terms side by side so that people can gradually get used to seeing the language in their daily lives and learn to use at least a few expressions in conversation, like asking for the restroom or something. Why ask for that in English when it's probably something you could learn to ask for pretty easily in the language? So you don't have to be immersed in the language and become an apprentice to someone at 20 hours a week to pick up a little bit of the everyday common language community conversational kind of things that are important in life. Another approach to this working on the conversation aspect it has to do with our next graphic, and I call this the basic 14 vocabulary. It was going to be a basic dozen. That's kind of what I had in mind, but I kept wanting to add a few other things. The idea of this is that if you are trying to do a language immersion program, or if you're in a class and you're just trying to use English as little as possible, even if it's not a full immersion, if you're allowing some English, still, I think these 14 things, and you might want to add or subtract 1 or 2, but this short list is things that you should learn right away to say in the language that you're learning. And then never again say those in English. What kind of things are they? Well, the first one I put down again. That's the way it happens to come out in Comanche. You say tasa, but what I was looking for there is some kind of word, phrase or word to ask someone for a repetition. If you're a language learner, very often you need someone to say something 2 or 3 times before you really catch it. So you need to be able to ask them, and why ask them in English if you can have a simple expression for this in the other language? Ask them, tasa, tasa, to ask them to repeat something for you. Another one, very important, do you understand? You need to be able to ask this sometimes of your teacher, and your teacher needs to be able to ask it of you. Another one, don't speak English. If you are trying to avoid English as much as possible, it's good to have some phrase. It might say, Choctaw only, or no English please, or don't speak English, or something to that effect. If you can learn that expression, it's a good reminder people can give you as you're learning. They will gently throw this expression at you again and again, and the students can suggest this to each other also. Also, it's good to have these next two expressions, a way of saying that's good and that's bad or that's wrong. I mean, it might be talking about language or talking about other things. A way to say that something is good or that it's not so good. Another important thing is hello or some kind of greeting, and the greeting that goes back to it. They're not always the same. Sometimes you need to learn a greeting and the response to the greeting. Another very important one, help me. If you are trying to think of a word and you can't, and you're trying to learn some Comanche, you can say, naraitua, help me. Why say that in English if you know how to say it in Comanche? It keeps you more in the language and more focused on what you're trying to learn. And of course you want expressions for yes and no. Perhaps you want to add maybe to that. And the next one, your turn, that's good for a classroom situation where you have a number of students present and you want to make sure that the students do something in turn. They may have some exercise they're going through, and instead of saying, okay, now you, or your turn now, or you're next, why not just come up with an expression in the language and use that each time? Because that's an expression you'll use many times in every class. And repetition is important in language learning. So that's an expression people ought to be able to learn pretty quickly if you use it in the native language. Another one that might be good is thank you. Some people have told me there isn't an expression for thank you in their language, but maybe there's something else that's said to express appreciation. If there is, that should be on this list, I think, because you want to make sure that your teacher's feeling appreciated and that they know that you do appreciate what they're doing for you. Another very powerful expression is, what's this? When I used to co-teach Comanche classes at OU, and I made sure everybody learned that expression the first week. So they might have only been able to answer that question with 2 or 3 things. What's this? It's a dog, it's a horse, it's a cow. Maybe that's all they can say. But if you know how to say, what's this? That opens the door to all kinds of vocabulary to you, and especially if you're trying to do an immersion approach and not use English at all, that should be maybe the first expression that you use. You can mime an action and say, what's this? And learn verbs. You can point to an object and say, what's this? And learn nouns, and so forth. You can draw a picture of a certain kind of weather and say, what's this? And get the answer, the thing that you didn't know yet, to how to say it's raining or it's snowing or it's sunny. And finally, there are 2 expressions that are good, especially for classroom situations or any kind of structured situation. You want to be able to say when it's time to take a break and when the lesson is over. So something like that's all, or it's over, or we're done, and something like time for a break. If you can do those 14 things and never again do them in English, believe me, it'll have a big effect on your whole feeling of your language lessons. You'll feel like your life is starting to be at least partly in the language and not just talking about the language. So, a few more comments about what works and what doesn't. Just a few tips that sort of go throughout any method that you may use. One is, remember that any method of teaching requires some training. You can't just put an elder in the preschool not knowing what's expected of them and expect that everything's going to work. They need a little training workshop or something. Everybody needs to get together on a method and rules. Are we going to do this with English aloud or without English? Are there certain basic vocabulary items we'll never use in English? If so, what are they? Let's get together and make sure we're agreed on how to say these things. In a more structured class, a high school or a college class, for instance, there might be a lot more training involved and some curriculum and materials need to be worked up and so forth. But in the preschool or the one-on-one, it's more like a sort of an orientation that you need to give the teachers and probably the students as well to help get them ready for what's going to happen. If you're trying to use the language more at the tribe, you need to get together on how to translate things, which things are most important, and try to work to phase it in. Some tribes require that everyone that works at the complex take a language class. Well, what sort of things should they learn first and what next and so on? It's good to have an idea of phasing something in terms of using the language in real life. Another tip, I mentioned this briefly, make sure as much as possible you combine language and culture. Sometimes not just traditional culture, that's always good because that's threatened too in many tribes. To some degree, I guess it's threatened in all tribes because a lot of the young people are just becoming very assimilated and don't know the old ways. But you can take advantage of the knowledge that children have of modern culture too. You can take a well-known English language song, for instance, Mary Had a Little Lamb or something like that, and teach them their numbers by putting them to that music or some other vocabulary that you'd like them to learn. So you can borrow what they already know from English culture to help as a sort of crutch to help them learn the native language. And I believe very strongly in using songs, by the way, as much as possible. Also develop activities for fluent and semi-fluent speakers. One thing that I know the Comanche Language Committee found out was that they had willing fluent speakers who could talk their whole lives in Comanche if they had to. They never came up wanting for a word, but they found when they tried to do immersion activities, a weekend or a class with no English, only Comanche, the English kept slipping in. Even though they didn't intend for it to, it did, because that habit of flipping back and forth between Comanche and English in their conversation was so strongly ingrained, it was really hard for them to break that habit and force themselves to use Comanche only. If you have some activities for fluent speakers to talk to each other, to reinforce each other's use of the language and of no English, that can be helpful in a situation like that. And some of your semi-fluent speakers who aren't good enough to be a teacher, but with a little brush up might become good enough to help a teacher, say in a preschool. If you have activities for them too with the more fluent speakers to kind of pull them up to a little bit higher level of fluency, that's very good. And of course try to be inclusive, work from the grassroots up, let your community language programs really be rooted in the community and not in politics or the funding structure or the university or the local school. All of these things can contribute to your program, but it needs to be something that the people want and the people are learning. So always try to be inclusive and make everyone feel they're welcome to participate. As a last thing I'd like to say in terms of what's the solution to the situation, the following are not a solution, although they can be very useful. It's not a solution simply and only to have adult classes. It's not a solution simply and only to do linguistic analysis of your language, or to do a mere archiving, put a lot of stuff on tape and put it on a shelf somewhere. That's not going to save a language. Or to have students memorize a lot of word lists and do nothing but memorizing word lists. All of these things are good things to do, but not as the only thing. You need to concentrate on teaching children, doing immersion as much as possible, and doing conversation as much as possible. So what are some common mistakes? We only have a few minutes left, but I'll try to hit on some of these. These are things that people have told me. After a while, they start sounding like excuses. I don't think people mean them as excuses. These are reasons that they've heard that something can't be done, and they get discouraged, and they think, well, it can't be done. For instance, people will say, oh, we can't do it. Our council won't fund it. We keep trying to get them to fund a language program, and they won't do it, so we can't do it. End of story. There are often other ways to get things funded. There's a lot you can do without funding. Please don't let something like that stop you. And sometimes if you start on a very small program, a little bit of success can change that political reality and get the tribe more interested in funding a program, because they begin to see, hey, maybe it's not too late. Maybe this can work. They're really making some progress even without funding. Another thing, people will say, we can't write our language, it's not a written language. Now, preschool teaching and other immersion type teaching doesn't even require writing, so that's not really an excuse. All of us learned our first language before we learned our first writing system. But also every language in the world was at one point not a written language until someone devised a writing system for it, and it became popularized and useful to people. So any language can become a written language if you decide you want that for your language. People say we can't talk about modern things, VCRs, cameras, TVs, and so forth. This is an ancient language. We can't talk about those things. Well, neither could any other language in the world before those things were invented. When they were invented, every language community had to get together and come up with some idea of what are we going to call this thing. Indian language communities can do that too, just like the English did it, just like the Germans and the Swahilis and everyone else has done it. So don't get too discouraged. It may not be an easy thing to do, but it can be done. Some people say, our language is just too hard. It's not like English, it's a hard language. Well, this is just an illusion. To me, it's a way of saying, I call it WTMF. Won't try, might fail. It's hard to you if it's not familiar to you. Any language you might care to study will be hard at first. If you have a good teacher and you're patient with yourself and your teacher is patient with you, it becomes easier and easier. Believe me, English is very hard for non-English speakers to learn. It seems impossibly hard if you're not familiar with it, and it is. It's all a point of view kind of thing. So again, try not to get too discouraged. Just try. Two more popular misconceptions have to do with technology. People will say, oh, we'll get our language on the computer and that's going to save it. Or they'll say, we'll write everything down in a book and that'll save it. Or we're going to videotape everything and that'll save the language. None of these things in and of themselves save the language. The language isn't saved unless and until people are speaking the language to each other again. That's what keeps the language alive as a living language, and that's what's really required. A lot of people have this misconception that as an adult they can learn the language and then they'll pass it on to their kids. So they're going to take charge. They're going to learn the language from someone as a 35-year-old person, and then they're going to teach their little 3-year-old child. Good luck. Maybe it's been done, but I think the odds of that working are very, very low. What you need to do is have the child learn, then the child can teach the adult, or the adult can learn as a separate thing. But don't have the child's learning depend on the fluency of an adult who didn't learn the language until they were already grown. People at that stage in life seldom learn a language perfectly, seldom become fully fluent. They usually will have an accent, they'll have gaps in their vocabulary, they'll have awkward wordings. They're not going to be perfect at the language. Even though they get fluent, they won't be perfect. You need your children to learn from those perfect role models, the people who know the language inside out, speak it flawlessly. So, I guess we have to wrap up. I had more points to make, but just make sure any language program has to be in a constant state of reevaluation. Find out, are we making any progress? Are more people speaking it this year than last year? Do people only know ceremonial things, or can they really talk back and forth to each other like people in other languages can? Are the youngest tribe members involved? Do you have, or are you inventing names for new technology and new situations as they come up? If the answers to any of these questions are no, you need to improve things. Make sure, and this is our last graphic, make sure that your language doesn't join the 13 or so that were Oklahoma Indian languages and are already gone from the state. About 5 of these are still spoken in other states or in Canada, but they're all gone from Oklahoma, and this could happen to those other 25 languages as well. Make sure it doesn't. Thank you for joining us tonight, and see you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita.